Thank you very much. And thank you also for the invitation and the nice introduction. And I will immediately go on and will give you an idea about our most recently published study on the comparative effects of S-ketamine and racemic or SR-ketamine. Okay. So at first, to go directly into the matter, because we don't have as much time, I will give you at first a short idea about the questionnaire, which has been used recently much more than in the past, which is the 5D APZ questionnaire, which is a questionnaire developed to measure altered states of consciousness, especially in respect to those which have been induced by hallucinogenic drugs. And this questionnaire has 5 dimensions of measurement. First off, the oceanic boundlessness, which is a kind of positive state which you experience in euphoria. You might have kind of dissolved borders with the environment, with other people, but it's a very agreeable state. You might even call it a mystical state if it has a very large expression, or if it is extensively measured with this scale. So if the bars are higher in that respect, you have a much more positive experience. Then the second dimension, which is dread of ego dissolution. So if you have a kind of altered state of consciousness, you might feel like being manipulated, you might feel like you can't go out of it, you might go crazy, you might die from it and stuff like that. So that might represent what they have called dread of ego dissolution or anxious ego dissolution, the opposite of oceanic boundlessness, where you also have a kind of ego dissolution in a gradual sense, but in a positive experienced way. A third dimension is visionary restructuring. You might have heard that LSD, for example, gives you a kind of vision in the outside world, as well as if you close your eyes, you get imagery very extensively. These drugs have been called fantastica because of that. And so this dimension is measuring the visual aberrations and the inner visionary state, so to say. Then there is another dimension which is called vigilance reduction. So reduction of vigilance, clouding of consciousness. If you are getting tired, stuff like that will be measured with that dimension. And you also have the dimension auditory alterations, which you might know from schizophrenics or so, that they hear voices, they hear noises. And some people on hallucinogenic drugs also have auditory alterations quite a bit. So this can be measured, these few things can be measured with that questionnaire. We have used it consistently, and so therefore I give you that introduction about it. So here I give you a little bit of pictures about it. This might be an oceanic boundlessness state where the body borders kind of dissolve in the environment, as you can see here in this picture, but that's a positive state. So the anxious ego dissolution might be presented in this picture, an anxious state where you don't know what happens and might be something bad and so on and so on. And then you have the visionary restructuralization. This is an LSD vision, not a ketamine vision, which is much more rudimentary. Usually it's not as scenic and it has no real connection to your personal biography as much and so on. It's more a more primitive kind of vision or visualizations. This is a more complex one from a ketamine trip, a little bit more concept, but you see that's not as complex and not as dynamic as with the other hallucinogenic drugs. So if you look at our first study, which we have conducted with different dosages, you will see here the subjective effects. On the left side is a placebo. Here you see the low dose, here you see the high dose. This is the positive state, this is a negative state, this is a visionary state, this is vigilance reduction, and this is auditory hallucinatory effects. And you can see, this is why I present it here, that there is a linear kind of dose relationship to these effects. And so you see, yeah, the higher the dose, the higher will these effects be, which can be measured that way. And the same is true for not a self-rating, it's an outsider rating of psychopathology with the Price Psychiatric Rating Scale, well-known instrument, but also here you can see there is a kind of linear relationship in respect to the psychopathological features of that state induced by ketamine. We have used a dosage equivalent to maybe 50 to 60 milligrams intramuscular. And if you look at comparisons with other psychoactive substances from our experiments, you will see the people had eyes closed. I just want to give you that advice, because it's usually, if you sit in a laboratory and have your eyes open, you don't see as much visionary stuff with MDMA or even with ketamine. If you close your eyes, it's much more strange and impressive. And so you can see here the same measurement dimensions fit here too. So this is oceanic boundlessness with LSD, some anxiety, some visionary stuff going on, not so much vigilance reduction, some auditory alterations. With MDMA, even less, and with amphetamine, for sure, quite less, because the alteration of consciousness is not really grave. But with ketamine, there is some alteration, but especially this bar is very high, because the clouding of consciousness hinders also a real psychedelic effect, especially if it comes to memorizing the state or going into your personal stuff, and that's not as much the case with that drug. Just to give you an idea about comparisons. And you could say that ketamine is I wouldn't even call it a psychedelic, but if you want to call it a psychedelic, it's an unusual psychedelic in respect to the following factors. So the vigilance reduction is very impressive. There is a significant clouding of consciousness, especially if it goes higher than 40 milligrams intramuscular or equivalent. There is a certain emotional blunting. There is a reduction of the body feeling. There's also a reduction in feeling your emotions usually. There's also a fragmented cognition, even more so in comparison to MDMA or even LSD. There is a kind of strange thought disorder. And there are also grave mnestic disturbances, which you don't have with LSD, MDMA, or amphetamine, even an amnesia afterwards, so that you don't remember the experience anymore, which makes a big difference to the usual psychedelics. There's also not so much scenic imagery, where you experience some scenes from your personal life, or even fantasizing or imaginizing about your personal stuff. It's not that much with ketamine, and the visions are much more strange and even much more foggy, clouded, whatever you want to call it. And also the insightfulness that had been proven in recent studies is also very low. So your mind might be altered in a way that you can't really use it as easily in therapeutic work in comparison to LSD, psilocybin, or MDMA. Okay, now I come to our study. So we had done some pilot experiments from our first studies, and at that point in time, S-ketamine came up. So we had the opportunity to compare S-ketamine to racemic ketamine, and we immediately came to the conclusion that racemic ketamine is much more easy to cope with the psychopathological effects than with S-ketamine and the induced effects by S-ketamine. So we conducted this, or planned and designed this study. So I want to go a little bit into, Rupert told me to do so, into the enantiomers and their properties, so to say. And there you can see S-ketamine, it's a much more potent anesthetic, even if you can't give just 1/4 of the dose to reach the equivalent effects to the racemic dose. You have to give half of the racemic dose. So you give the same dose of S-ketamine as you give before, but with the racemic stuff, you have the R-ketamine on board too, so to say. R-ketamine, if it is used in a pure fashion, you will see it's non-hallucinatory, no hallucinatory, no body feeling alterations, but a more kind of diffuse state of relaxation and well-being will be felt. So it's ketamine without hallucinatory and body feeling alterations, so to say. It has been argued, especially in anesthesia, that there is much less of a body load of the substance in the system, and that might be advantageous. And therefore, S-ketamine was favored. But behind the scene, it's also a truth that racemic ketamine is out of patent. So it's a generic. And when the patent was going out, they immediately showed up with S-ketamine to prolong their patent rights, so to say. So they argued in favor of S-ketamine for these reasons too. And it has been proven in very early rudimentary studies that there might be a faster and easier recovery from ketamine induced anesthesia. But you have to realize that in anesthesia, the stuff will be given together with benzodiazepines simultaneously, so that you don't feel all these nightmarish stuff and visionary and psychopathological stuff as much. So it's not an easy to solve question if it is a faster recovery because of the ketamine, or is there an interaction with the benzodiazepines and so on. Just want to mention that. What we have also found in our experiments is that there were much less psychedelic effects with esketamine from our point of view or our experience. There is a faster elimination, a pharmacokinetic feature of esketamine with esketamine. And interestingly enough, if you give the racemic ketamine, it has been proven that the R enantiomer hinders the elimination of the S-ketamine by an unknown mechanism, as far as I know. And interestingly enough, we know from more recent studies that R-ketamine has a significant antidepressant effect comparable to S-ketamine, but it has a far more lower affinity to the NMDA receptor, which somewhat puts in question the speculation about the NMDA receptor might be the target of ketamine's antidepressant effects. I just want to give you that for your own thoughts. So the antidepressant effects of R-ketamine are longer lasting, as we know from a very few studies. And interestingly enough, the abuse kind of effects, which might make it more attractive for drug users to take, just appear at much higher doses than the antidepressant effects. And the trials up to now, we have some experimental studies which have been conducted not on necessarily on depressive patients, but we have one study by Leal et al., which is from the methodology very insufficient. So it gives you some evidence there are antidepressant effects, but they haven't been proven in a formal, correctly designed, methodologically sound study up to now. Okay, what was our experimental design? It was a randomized double-blind clinical trial, and we had chosen a parallel group design. So we had 3 groups of 10 people, healthy volunteers, usually medical students, doctors, and some other volunteers in the age range of, let's say, 25 to 45. And we also had access to a facility where we could do plasma level determination, which was kind of a few years ago, not as easy to do, but we were able to realize that. So we had a continuous measurement of plasma levels, and we had BPRS ratings by the experimenter and the psychopathological self-ratings, mainly with the 5D APZ. We had other stuff involved too, but that's not as much important to give in this short lecture here. And we had neurocognitive tests, which we have conducted with our experimental subjects. So if we come to the results, you will see here the S-ketamine and the racemic ketamine. Here is a placebo, not of much interest for us. But you can see here that S-ketamine has lower oceanic boundlessness, so lower good feeling, so to say. Oh, sorry. And it has somewhat 25% more anxiety than racemic ketamine. Astonishingly enough, if you think, okay, these both of the enantiomer contribute to the psychopathology, you would expect even a certain amount of more psychopathology if you give these 2 enantiomers together. You add, so to say, to the S-ketamine, the R-ketamine, you might get more psychopathology. That's a logical thought. But it's not the case, it seems. So you have less visionary stuff going on here with S-ketamine, and the vigilance reduction, interestingly enough, is also somewhat higher in comparison to the racemic ketamine. And what is really significant also for the well-being of the subject is that the auditory alterations with S-ketamine are double as high as with racemic ketamine. And these alterations are mostly really strange. So they might people make afraid, they might people they produce anxiety in sensitive persons because of this irritation kind of things. And it's even more irritating if you have auditory hallucinations than visual alterations in the usual person. So here it seems, even if these differences are not really significant with our small numbers, if you would extend the trial to 3 groups of 30 people, you will have definitely significant differences in all these parameters, which we just see trends or numeric alterations to a significant amount partially, so that we can take these results somewhat serious, I think. So interestingly enough, because we were specialized in our laboratory to measure subjective alterations of consciousness, and we were aware that sometimes if you use certain questionnaires, you might confront the problem that these questionnaires might be not sensitive enough for specific alterations what you look out for. And if you put these kind of mean scores then together, you might not find the difference because of different questions and different answers and stuff like that. So what we did is we designed from our pilot experiments, we designed a few items which we have combined with a visual analog scale of 100 millimeters so that the subjects could go on and sign these things. And so these were the items and the results from these from the study. So impression to lose control over the experience and over yourself. So this is S-ketamine, this is racemic ketamine, no difference, and this was placebo. So the next item has been, I felt like losing contact with reality. This is S-ketamine again. This is racemic ketamine. This is placebo. So not that big of a difference. Feelings threaten to overwhelm me. This is S-ketamine. This is racemic ketamine. There is a certain difference. And this is placebo again. And we asked this question, was there ease to give up into the experience? This is S-ketamine, this is racemic ketamine, and this is placebo. The next question would be, I couldn't direct my thoughts anymore, and this is S-ketamine, this is racemic ketamine, and this is placebo again. So you see that in some specific items, especially related to ease to give up into the experience, to have a certain flow of the experience or participation or more immersed in your emotions somewhat. That could be a conclusion from these tentative results. So my personal metaphor for the difference in between the state of consciousness and the experiential flow in respect to S-ketamine and racemic ketamine is the metaphor is the following. If you go in a lake, you will feel the water around your body. So it's the same like in a river on the picture below. But your concrete feeling in the situation, it's quite a different deal if you are immersed in a lake, in a static state, so to say. It makes much of a difference than to have, in comparison, to have the dynamic flow of the swimming experience in a flowing river. That is the difference on a subjective level. It describes, I have been involved with ketamine since 20 years, so I have some reasons, some empirical data, even from my own experience, to make up this metaphor. And so it might be much easier for a subject which is also stuck in depression and also stuck in such a psychopathological altered state on ketamine, might be much more agreeable to go with the flow, to have an ease to give up into the experience and have some emotions involved so that something is really bringing you forward and you have a much more dynamic impression of the whole experience. So I'm coming back to the ketamine enantiomers in respect to neuroimaging, because that might explain parts of these different experiential patterns. So S-ketamine in general increases brain metabolism, and it has been shown that especially in the auditory areas of the brain, there is an activation in respect to metabolism if it comes to S-ketamine. R-ketamine instead decreases brain metabolism. So there is a certain more subcortical arousal, which could explain more emotions on that racemic trip by R-ketamine. But interesting to know is that R-ketamine itself does not give you more subcortical arousal, but it deactivates some of the increases, or it decreases some of the decreases induced by S-ketamine. So it kind of dumps the S-ketamine effect somewhat down, right? And so because it's mainly in the cortical sphere where you have these contradicting effects on metabolism, you might have more arousal because the activation of S-ketamine is somewhat decreased. And therefore subcortical arousal can take more place, so to say. Yeah, this is said here. And it has been speculated, especially by Vollenweider, who has quite a bit of knowledge about these things, that there might be a more harmonious dynamic of deactivations and activations in respect to cortical and subcortical metabolism with the racemic mixture. Even the term harmonious dynamics has been used in this early study by Vollenweider, which has been conducted with a very reliable PET scanner. Okay, now we come to the last slides. These are the neurocognitive results in respect to the substances which we have looked out for. I kind of eliminate the placebo because we are mainly focusing on the comparison here. And there you can see this is a Benton test. It's a visual memory test. So it's somewhat better results with S-ketamine, right? And then we look out for the go-no-go paradigm, which is in kind of, you got some images on the screen and you have to push the button at certain images. So you have to select, so to say, it's an executive function test, so to say. You will see here in comparison, even to placebo, there's no difference with both sorts of ketamine, right? Then we come to the divided attention, which is very much altered if you compare it to placebo under the ketamine stuff. And it is more or less good, the reactions in divided attention tasks with racemic ketamine in comparison to S-ketamine. If it comes to the, oh, sorry, I can't see that here right now. Not really. So could somebody help me and say maybe, because it's over here, it's overlaid by the pictures of my screen here. So, okay, the fourth thing, I can't tell you anything, but there's no big difference. And I think the last one might be, no, there's reaction time. That is also not much different, but it's different from placebo, but not in between the both enantiomers. And then at last you have signal detection, which is a sustained attention task. And you see that also that in this case, ketamine, S-ketamine, it's a little less good as in comparison to racemic ketamine, which might be dependent on the fact that your vigilance is somewhat a little bit lower with S-ketamine. So in respect to neurocognition, you can see that some neurocognitive features are a little bit better with S-ketamine. And this has been verified that the plasma levels were equivalent at that point when we did the neurocognitive testing. So the synopsis could be, sorry, I haven't animated that appropriately, and I also can see the first one. So with S-ketamine, there's more anxiety in the realm of 25%. There's much more auditory alteration, even 50% more. And the general experience on S-ketamine, if you give it as a sole substance, it's less agreeable to the subjects. Also, if you ask them for a comparison, and experienced researchers which have experienced the substance themselves will also agree with that. And there is a certain higher risk of a bad trip. This comes from static state anxiety, the static state, what I've described, the river takes much more, it takes you much more with it. So it's less risky to come into a bad anxious state. There's also more anxiety with S-ketamine and much more auditory alteration, which might enhance the risk of a bad trip. And interestingly enough, it has been found that R-ketamine and S-ketamine have both antidepressants effects, but by different neurobiological mechanisms. So it could be an idea to combine these mechanisms in the racemic mixture, which might lead to better results. And it seems that RS, or racemic ketamine, produces an easier to cope with experience, so less risk for the patients, much more agreeable experience, so to say. And this might be due to a more harmonious alteration of brain metabolism. And our conclusion in our paper was that it might be worthwhile to test different mixtures of R and S ketamine for future applications as an antidepressant drug. Thanks for your attention. You don't get any applause, you don't get anything. I even can't see you. So that's how you are deprived from sensory deprivation from giving lectures. However, no.
Okay, thanks very much.
We can
indeed.
talk now, right?
We'll give you a round of applause for that. Yes, we've got Tiago saying clap, clap, clap in the chat.
Okay, got it.
So, yeah, thank you very much for that, Torsten. Lots of interesting things there to discuss. Please, could people put their questions into the Q&A panel rather than in the chat? So I'm just going to kick off with sort of a couple of clarificatory questions about the study, if I may, and we'll keep focused on the study. We'll focus the questions on the study just for the first part. And could I just ask you a little bit about how you decide in your study what doses of S-ketamine versus racemic ketamine to use? Because my understanding is that yes, S-ketamine has 4 times potency at the NMDA receptor compared to R-ketamine. Yeah. But I think in your study you basically selected a 2-to-1 ratio, didn't you?
Yeah, it's right, and we have
twice as much racemic as the concentration for the racemic was twice as much as for the S-ketamine, and also that in difference to other studies, what you've done is that you've given a loading dose, and then actually this is a 60-minute duration infusion that you've given.
This our idea to use it that way came from Hans-Anton Adams, who was the leading researcher in ketamine in anesthesia in Germany. And he gave us that advice. And we also had tested it before in respect to the plasma levels, so that we could see that there is a certain logic behind. So if you want to test or compare S-ketamine versus racemic ketamine, you should use the same amount of S-ketamine, so to say, in a way. But in this case, we have, because we don't want to have an additional effect from the R-ketamine. So we came to the conclusion from his experience as well as from the literature that we have to use a 1-to-2 ratio. That was okay. And it's still a consensus in the literature, as far as I understand it, that it has to be done that way if you want to compare these two. And the results are somewhat consistent with that approach, I think.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to just ask one more question before we go over to those in the Q&A, and that's really about the significance levels in the subjective comparisons. So can I just understand understand what you were saying? Are you saying that on those 5 measures of the subjective measures, that there was no significant difference between the S-ketamine and the racemic ketamine on any of those measures? Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. And this comes also from the fact that ketamine induces a certain alteration of consciousness, which has different kind of aspects, so to say, and the standard deviations in respect to the different aspects are very high. So you have a kind of, you could say, chaotic kind of pattern. And I have some slides, I couldn't present them because the time was not there, that if you give ketamine, racemic ketamine, to a patient, you might have a kind of mosaic of effects. And sometimes these factors constellate in a way that you have a very good flow of a psychedelic experience. At other times that may be might be much more chaotic and unagreeable and stuff like that. So that is one factor. The other factor is, you're right, there were no significant differences, but this depends somewhat on the standard deviation, which was very high because of these different constellations, what I mentioned. And the other thing is what I already mentioned, if we would have done 30 patients per group, these results would be definitely significant. So it's suspicious to argue that way somewhat, but on the other side, you have to look at, in a pragmatic way, at results. And so you could say, yeah, okay, if you have the 50% more auditory alterations, you know, if the standard deviation wouldn't have been so high, then it would be definitely a significant difference.
And if I can nail you down on the same point with your neurocognitive data, it looked to me as if the divided attention might be significant. Was that actually a significantly different result in the divided attention between the S-ketamine and the?
As far as I remember, yes.
Okay.
That was, I think, the only significant difference.
Okay. So we've got a question here, and I think the answer to this is no, but you'll confirm this. Has any study looked at, say, 1 to 4 R2S ketamine?
No, as far as I know, there has been no study ever which have compared different doses of both enantiomers, so to say. It was just used the racemic mixture 50-50, and that was it.
Okay.
And we had a very hard time to get R-ketamine. We were not able to, even if we had directly contact through Professor Adams to Park Davis and other companies, but they were not able to present us any R-ketamine. Otherwise, we would have tested it in comparison.
Okay, and just I feel I do need to say this. You know, it's an obvious thing that we should have said it right at the beginning. Is that, of course, ketamine is not a licensed treatment for anything for depression. Yeah. There is a licensed version of S-ketamine for depression.
In Germany, we have that.
And sorry.
The intranasal S-ketamine is legal in Germany, meanwhile.
Yeah, it is in Europe. So there's a licensed version of S-ketamine. But S-ketamine is generically available in other formulations as well, but not licensed for depression. So, so we've got further questions here. I know that you looked at the metabolites in your study. Can you say something about that?
No, not as much. You have these, it's a complex matter in itself. We could talk about that for half an hour, because there has been quite a bunch of hypotheses about what the metabolite does what and stuff like that. I don't want to go into that here as much. So we have found norketamine for sure, and it is still not quite clear in how far this metabolite contributes to the psychopathological effects, especially if you have then 3 or 4 different substances on board with the original stuff which is still in the organism. So you can't really get a clue to what extent the metabolites might contribute.
Okay, and can you say anything about the why there might be a difference between the S and the R? Is there differences in the mechanisms, or some more orientated towards NMDA receptors and others more towards the AMPA?
Yeah, so this is a complex matter, as you might know from all the reviews and all the stuff which has been published about ketamine. Our idea is that it seems that racemic ketamine and therefore R-ketamine might kind of weaken or mitigate the psychopathological side effects of S-ketamine somewhat. You can think about another example, which is THC, cannabis, THC versus CBD. So CBD somewhat copes some of the psychoactive effects of THC. So it's in a way kind of the same thing in a way, but here you have different enantiomers which kind of hinder the expansion of the psychopathology. And I have given you an idea in respect to neurometabolic features of both enantiomers and the racemic ketamine. There might be a better, a more harmonious pattern about that, but I don't know as much about different receptor affinities and the metabolites and all these things. So it might be more complex than I could figure out here, or I can figure out here. And another problem is that we have not looked out for the mechanism. We were out for looking about the comparative effects.
Okay.
Right? And so therefore we can speculate together with the stuff in the literature, but I don't think that the mechanism of ketamine in depression has really been elucidated up to now. There are different things into play, and please don't believe as much in the BDNF stuff. This is the last resort where everybody jumps on right now because the other things are kind of inconsistent. So they think, oh, you got nerve growth in your brain. Be careful with these kind of theories. It sounds plausible, but it isn't. If you go on a vegetarian meal for a few months, you have another BDNF level and these kind of things. I don't know what's about sex and what else interferes with BDNF induction. So be careful. And if there would be a BDNF factor involved and spreading of synapses, I, as a patient, don't want that. I don't know what happens to my brain. I mean, these doctors say to me, yeah, it might be helpful in depression, but then afterwards I have a kind of brain where something is glued to another. Some parts are having more synapses and stuff like that. I don't want that. It's not fascinating to me. It's a threat to me personally.
Okay, well, that sort of answers the last question on the